Hello, welcome back to Reading to Write. I'm very excited about today's video. Originally, I was going to do a what else I've been reading in 2023 video, but I think I've discovered that I don't really like filming those types of videos. I found it very difficult to kind of talk about, and I was really exhausted after I did the video, so instead we're going to do this. If you haven't read the title, we are going to be talking about what it's like reading with a writer's brain, which I think is a much better fit for this channel since I do want this to be about being a reader with a writer's brain. So yeah, I've written down some weird things that I do, which some of them might not be very unique from things that other people do who really like stories or are just avid readers, but some I think are a little unique to people who are either writers or editors. So let's get into it. The first thing, and just to start this with a bang, is sometimes I keep books that I hate so I have a reference for things that I don't want to do in my own writing. I have an example, and that example is The Institute by Stephen King. I feel like this is like basically setting a bomb off in the booktube community, because I know Stephen King is a super loved author and his stands might come for me, but I don't think that this one is like celebrated as one of his best works. It is one of his newer ones. I think it came out in 2019. If you don't know, this is a story about a bunch of kids who are taken to this place called the Institute because they have psychic powers, and basically a lot of tests are done on them. I won't say more than that just because I don't want to spoil anything, but it's like kind of a horror meets sci-fi thriller book, and I just didn't love it. There are certain things about it that I really liked, and like some of the writing I think was well done. However, most of it was very telly, so a lot of the like major action scenes are kind of just being told what is going on as opposed to like being with the character doing the things that are happening. And then in particular, the ending kind of just drones on and on and on, and there are certain things that are done in it. If you want to read a spoilery Goodreads review, I've like kind of left all of my thoughts about this there, so I don't really want to say it in this video in case like there's somebody who wants to read this book still. But the ending was just basically felt like an excuse to do a bunch of exposition about something that King couldn't figure out another way to include in the story. And I just thought that it was like poorly executed. This book had a lot of potential, and I actually picked it up because I do have a sci-fi thriller that has to do with like psychics and a type of institution that's doing testing on them. So I thought maybe this would be like a good guide for me to see like how things are done and like sell well, but instead it kind of just became a warning of what not to do unless you want the plot line to be dragging and not have any emotional impact when like the climax happens and a whole bunch of characters that you should care about die. I'm sorry, please don't come for me. I'm not like condemning King as an author by any means. It's just this particular one was a miss, and I think I have kept it to be kind of like a reference for me to go back to see like things that didn't work for me personally in the storytelling. On the flip side of that, I think another thing I do is just like having golden books that I think are very inspirational in the way that they are written, or kind of in the imagery or the storytelling. Just to stick with the horror thing, Mexican Gothic I think is one of those books for me that like when I read it really blew me away. This book I think had a little bit of an advantage because I bought it when it first came out, so it was in the new fiction section instead of the horror section, and I didn't actually know it was a horror book. I thought it was a gothic mystery. So when all of the horror elements came out, it really blew me away, and I was like, oh my god, what on earth am I reading? But I think I would put this book as like a book that I consider inspirational just because I thought the writing was really well done. And also like if you boil the plot of this book down to its bare minimum and try to explain it to somebody, it sounds absolutely ridiculous. Literally all I'll say is mushrooms, right? Like that should be a ridiculous premise for a horror novel, but the execution is done so well that I think it really succeeds as a story. So I think that is part of why I would put this as like a book that I keep. I mean, not just because I love it and it is one of my favorite books of all time, but because the writing, the imagery that's painted through the writing, and just like the way the plot is executed is so well done that it really is a good reference for how a book, especially in modern day, should be written. The next thing that I do as a writer, which this I'm not sure is like super unique from other people who just really appreciate storytelling, is I will marvel at the way certain sentences are written or the way metaphors are painted or similes or like any kind of imagery basically, where I will like literally stop and be like, wow, that was amazing. How can I do that in my own writing? A good example of that is also Mexican Gothic. There are definitely a couple scenes in that book that really blew me away and I was just like awing over. But another book that does that really stood out to me, and I think is one of the first books that I really was able to see the difference in like a writer's storytelling, is For the Wolf. This book is kind of like a hybrid Beauty and the Beast meets Red Riding Hood, kind of like fairy tale-ish type thing. Basically, there's this kingdom that lives next to this magical haunted wood. The second daughter of the royal family is kind of sacrificed to the wood to keep it appeased so that it doesn't invade the land. Well, they're sacrificed to the wolf in the wood, who is like kind of the warden of it and keeps it from invading the people's land. Here is one example. This is on page 13. It's like the first chapter basically. Eric's grip was just shy of bruising, and with an angry surge like leaves caught in a cyclone, red shard of magic broke free. It clawed its way out of her bones, unspooling from the spaces between her ribs like ivy climbing ruins. The ferns on the sill arched toward her, called by some strange magnetism, and she felt the quickening of earth beneath her feet, even through the layers of marble, roots running like currents reaching for her. So it's just like the shard of magic clawing its way through her bones. There's just like this like pattern of word uses. A lot of it is very sharp or kind of wild, like an overgrowth of, you know, ferns and stuff like that. So I think that she just did a really good job of like the consistency of the imagery that she painted throughout this book that made it a very powerful way to do the storytelling. And I marveled at it each time that I kind of stumbled upon a new way that she described something. Another weird thing that I do as a writer is I tend to rewrite sentences in my head or correct grammar or like misspellings and stuff as I'm reading. I don't really have a good example to share since I do this all the time, but you know those sentences that you're sometimes reading where you like get caught on it because you can't understand what it is that's being said to you, so you have to read it over and over again. When I get caught on a sentence like that, I say, that doesn't make sense. You should have written it X, Y, and Z. And I kind of like rewrite it in my head and then move on. So I think that that's like a funny little thing as a writer that I tend to do. Another thing I do all the time, and this one I do not think is actually unique to writers, but as a writer, it's harder for me to not do this, is I tend to try and guess the plot as I'm going along. I do this with like movies and TV shows as well, which sometimes amazes my friends, sometimes annoys them. But one of the books that I've done that with recently is The Writing Retreat. I haven't fully finished this book yet. I'm kind of like halfway through, I think. But literally on page 17, there is a line that one of the characters says that I was like, oh, okay, well, I know that that's exactly what you're doing, and I am pretty sure that I'm right about the plot twist that foreshadowed to, so maybe I'll do like a little update in the future to let you know if I was right. That will probably have to be a spoilery one because I don't know how I would do that without it being spoilery, but that's another weird thing that I do. I'm just always trying to guess what's gonna happen. Another weird thing that I do is I keep basically a dump of words that I find while I'm reading that I think are fascinating or amazing and I want to try to use in a future story of my own. When I stumble upon a word that I don't know the meaning of, I will look it up and then I will add it to this like little note that I have for future reference so that I can like try to use that word in my own writing. A good example of this is in the book Perdition. She uses the word scintillating all the time, which basically means to like sparkle or emit a flash. So that's like one of the words that's in my little brain dump. Sidebar. Perdition is probably my most favorite book of all time and is actually the only book that I've read twice. So I'll talk about that in a future video, but just a little sidebar. I think I mentioned in a past video that I really love language and the way words can be stitched together, and also that there's just vocabulary that I don't know that can better express a certain thing that you're trying to describe. So that's kind of, I guess, why I have a word dump for all of these words that I find that I think are fascinating and would love to use in my future writing. Another thing I do, which I don't have an example for this either, just because I kind of do it all of the time, is I will reread sentences or passages just because I think that they are so well written or they're so fascinating and I just want to have the immediate experience of reading it again. Another thing I do, and this is like, I feel like I'm a little bit of a spite writer. In that I will read something or like consider a plot or a trope that I hate the way author has executed it, and then I will think about how I could have executed it better. And sometimes I actually write it, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I don't have like enough inspiration for it to actually go through with writing it, but other times it does lead to story ideas. One example that I will give you that is not a story idea that culminated, but basically I think enough people are upset with the way Game of Thrones ended that we wish it would have been done differently. That was a case where I was like, this is absolutely garbage, and I talked with one of my writer friends at length on how we would have written it differently to be a more satisfying ending for like different character arcs and just like this series as a whole. So yeah, I guess that's something that like we probably all do to a certain degree, and just wishing things had gone differently, obviously, but then like thinking about how the story could have been different. But as a writer, sometimes I actually do take those ideas that I get from wanting to fix a certain like plot point or trope that I think was executed poorly, and I'll turn it into an actual story. So another thing that I do as a writer is I might discover a bit of information or like a creature type or, you know, a new like place in the world, and that piece of information will sink into a story idea that I have and will like make this big aha moment, or will be something that I want to save to use as a story element in the future. And a good example of that, which I have talked about multiple times now on this channel, but it's the most recent one that happened, and I think the easiest to talk about just because it is a simple thing that made a big difference for one of my stories, is Legendborn. I did not know in the original Legend of Merlin that he is the son of an incubus. So that is just like a thing in legend, and I found that out in this book because that is a piece of information that is in the original Legend of Merlin, and I am writing a story about an incubus. I was like, this is a great plot element that I can use, and kind of filled in a little bit more of this story that I'm writing about a fairy world that I didn't know I was even missing. So that is like an example of kind of how when I'm reading, sometimes something an author does or a piece of information in their research that I learn about will like help me in my own writing. And the last thing that I came up with for now that I do as a writer who reads is I will marvel at the way certain stories are similar or, you know, inspired by each other, or how like tropes are subverted within those similar stories. So the best example that I have that I recently went through is Uprooted. Uprooted is about this girl, Agnieszka, I think is her name, and she is chosen to become kind of like a servant to this powerful wizard called the Dragon. Turns out she has magical powers, so instead of just being his servant, she ends up being his apprentice as well. And this is another story that has a kind of evil magical wood, like for the wolf, where they're trying to like fight it from taking over the whole country. And I don't know if this is true, and I don't know where I heard this, but somewhere I either read or heard that Uprooted was kind of inspired by Beauty and the Beast. So going into the book, I was looking for the similarities. This part is going to have a little bit of spoilers. I'll try to keep them as brief as possible, but I just kind of want to talk about like the things that I was looking for and why this interested me as a writer. So the similarities between the two stories are like, you know, a girl gets taken and locked in a tower to live with the beast, quote unquote, or the dragon in this case. There's a part where there's an attack from wolves where the dragon saves her from them, but then he's injured and she has to take care of them, and they kind of like are a little bit warmer towards each other after that. There's a rose in it, a magical rose. The dragon is like very into beauty, and there's like this old sorceress that he kind of like brushed off because he just thought that she was an ugly old idiot, which is kind of reminiscent to the beginning of the Beauty and the Beast, when the beast was only interested in beautiful things and then gets cursed by an old ugly lady because he forsakes her for not being beautiful. And then yeah, there are a couple other similarities, but I found that like so fun to look for those kind of similarities. But then the story was different enough that the people in my group of friends who I read this book with and talked about later, who like didn't know that this story was inspired by Beauty and the Beast, they didn't pick up on those similarities. So it's obviously written different enough, and it's like in a completely different context, that it's not necessarily something that like these tropes and, you know, little nods to Beauty and the Beast aren't so blatant that they're a ripoff. But it was just like fun as a writer to be like, oh, I can see where you got that inspiration from, but like you did a really good job in like changing it up. Or, you know, you decided to scrap this whole bit of the plot, which I think was really smart because that wouldn't have worked for the actual narrative that you were telling. Yeah, that's like something that I'll do with like any story that I either know is inspired by another one, or I can kind of see similarities in like the way a certain trope is being presented, but then there are like little twists that different authors will do. It's a really fun exercise, honestly, like as a writer who's like interested in the way stories are told and retold, and like every story is inspired by other ones. Like clearly I'm talking about how, you know, Legendborn has like given me a piece of information from my own story. It happens with all of us, so it's just like cool to kind of like actively try to engage with that piece of storytelling. So yeah, that was, I guess, 10 things that I do as a writer, that some of them, you know, I think are unique to the plight of being a writer who is doing reading, but some of them, I'm sure a lot of you do some of these things as well. Basically, it all boils down to the fact that I cannot turn off my writer brain, and everything that I'm reading, I am somehow relating back to writing, since that is like my main passion and ultimately what I want to do with my life. So yeah, let me know what you think about these things. Are these things that you do yourself and you are not a writer? Or if you are a writer, are there other things that you do while you're reading that you think is kind of unique to the writer experience? I would really love to know. So please leave your thoughts down in the comments. As always, thank you for watching this video and being here with me, and I'll see you next time.